Olivia Carter had lived most of her adult life under the weight of silence, the kind that comes not from the absence of sound, but from the absence of hope. At 18, she was full of life, dancing at her prom, running through the gardens of her family's mansion, and dreaming of traveling the world on her own terms. But that dream shattered one summer evening when a reckless driver collided with her car. She survived, but the accident left her spine so damaged that walking became a distant memory. Overnight, Olivia's world transformed into a cage of wheels and stairs. For her father, Richard Carter, the billionaire real estate mogul whose name lit up skyscrapers across Los Angeles, the accident was a wound that wealth couldn't heal. He poured millions into doctors, clinics, and research programs across the globe, from Switzerland's most prestigious rehabilitation centers to New York's groundbreaking hospitals. He took Olivia everywhere he could. Each time the family hoped, prayed, and waited for a miracle. But every specialist, no matter how decorated, always ended with the same words: "She'll never walk again." Richard would return to his penthouse offices each time, furious at his own helplessness. Olivia's mother, Catherine, had once been the warmth of their family, but after years of watching her daughter suffer, she grew quieter, thinner, and consumed by her own grief. She supported Olivia in every way. She could reading to her, dressing her, sitting by her side, but her eyes always carried the shadow of loss. Olivia noticed it every day. The family's wealth filled their home with chandeliers, imported furniture, and art worth millions. But the laughter that once echoed in their mansion had long faded. Money couldn't buy back the life that had been stolen. Olivia herself bore the greatest pain. The days stretched endlessly, filled with therapy sessions that ended in disappointment and nights staring out the window of her room. She could see the city lights twinkling from the hills of Beverly Hills, where her family lived, but they only reminded her of what she couldn't touch. Her friends from school had moved on with their lives, college, careers, relationships, while she remained in the same chair, the same room, year after year. Invitations eventually stopped coming, and even those who loved her most treated her like porcelain. To them, she was fragile, incapable, and trapped forever. The cruelest part was the way the world admired her wealth but ignored her pain. Whenever she appeared in public, photographers snapped pictures of her designer wheelchair, her flawless dresses, and her family's fortune. The Carter, a princess, headlines called her, as if her suffering was hidden beneath luxury. Strangers whispered about her beauty, her grace, and her tragedy, but no one asked how she felt. She smiled politely for cameras, but when the lights dimmed, she cried alone. To Olivia, her wheelchair wasn't just a seat. It was a reminder that she had lost the freedom to move, to dance, to run. Richard Carter carried his guilt like a storm cloud. He had built an empire from the ground up, conquering every obstacle life had placed before him. But this, his daughter's suffering, was something he could not outspend or outsmart. He often sat in his study late into the night, staring at Olivia's childhood photos. He remembered teaching her how to ride a bike, how she would giggle when she fell and got up again. Now, the thought of her never standing again hollowed him out. For a man who commanded skyscrapers, he had never felt smaller. Every dollar he earned seemed useless in her presence. Olivia rarely blamed her father, but she saw the weight he carried. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she noticed his hands trembling as he adjusted her blanket or kissed her forehead. She wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that she had accepted her fate, but deep down she hadn't. She dreamed of walking again every night. She imagined standing under the California sun, feeling the grass between her toes, and running until she was breathless. Yet every morning, reality returned like a cruel reminder. The girl who once ran marathons in high school was now forever seated. One rainy afternoon, After yet another exhausting trip to a specialist in downtown Los Angeles, the Carter family's limousine pulled into a quiet neighborhood. Olivia's eyes were heavy from crying. The doctor had once again confirmed the same verdict. She will never regain full mobility. The words echoed in her ears as the rain splattered against the tinted glass of the limo. She stared out at the grey streets, feeling like the whole world had dimmed. With her, even her mother's gentle hand on her shoulder could not stop the tears that silently streamed down her cheeks. Then, unexpectedly, the limousine gave a shuddering lurch and came to a stop. The driver frowned, tried to restart the engine, but it sputtered and died. Richard cursed under his breath, annoyed at yet another inconvenience. The driver stepped out, umbrella in hand, and began calling for assistance. Olivia remained inside, her head leaning against the window, watching as droplets of rain distorted the shapes of the houses around them. This neighborhood was nothing like hers, small, modest. Homes lined the street, some with peeling paint and old cars parked in the driveways. It was a world far removed from the Carter empire. Minutes later, a man appeared walking briskly through the rain with a worn toolbox in hand. He was about 29, tall but slightly rugged, his shirt stained with grease and his hair damp from the drizzle. His name was Daniel Hayes, a mechanic, who ran a small garage down the street. He looked nothing like the polished specialists Olivia was used to seeing. His shoes were muddy, his jacket patched, and his face carried the marks of a man who had worked too hard for too little. Yet there was something steady about the way he moved, something unshaken by the storm. Daniel tapped on the driver's window and asked what the problem was. The driver gestured toward the engine, clearly impatient. Richard stayed inside, unwilling to step into the rain. Olivia, however, found herself curious. Through the window, she watched Daniel open the hood with practiced hands, leaning over the smoking engine as if it were an old friend. There was no hesitation, no panic, only calm concentration. For years, Olivia had watched doctors in white coats speak with rehearsed certainty, but this man worked with a quiet confidence that felt genuine. Something about him held her attention in a way she couldn't explain. Daniel's eyes flicked briefly toward the car's tinted window, and he caught sight of Olivia watching him. For a moment, they locked eyes, hers weary, his steady. He offered her a small nod, then returned to his work. Olivia blinked, surprised at the lack of pity in his gaze. Everyone else who looked at her saw the wheelchair first, the tragedy second. But this mechanic had looked at her as though she were simply a person. It was such a small thing, yet it stirred something inside her, something she thought she had buried long ago. Hope. Daniel tightened the last bolt under the limousine's hood, his hands steady despite the drizzle trickling down his arms. The engine hummed back to life, and the driver exhaled in relief. But Olivia wasn't watching the car anymore. She was watching him. When Daniel glanced toward her and saw the wheelchair tucked beside her in the back seat, he didn't avert his eyes the way most people did. Instead, he asked gently, "Was it an accident?" Olivia froze. For a moment, then nodded slowly. No one had ever asked so plainly. People tiptoed around her reality, but Daniel had walked right into it. He wiped his hands on his shirt, smudging the fabric with darker stains, and said something that startled her. "Engines, bodies, they're not that different. Sometimes people just give up too soon, but everything can be rebuilt." Olivia blinked, stunned. For years, she had heard polished specialists explain what she could never do again. Their tone was always final, almost rehearsed. But this stranger, a poor mechanic in a soaked shirt, spoke of possibility. It wasn't pity. It wasn't false comfort. It was hope, raw and unpolished, but hope nonetheless, and it struck her deeper than she expected. Her father, still inside the car, barely noticed the exchange. Richard Carter had already turned back to his phone, dismissing the mechanic as just another worker. The limousine purred back to life, and soon they were on their way, leaving the modest street behind. But Olivia's thoughts stayed with Daniel. His words replayed in her mind like an echo she couldn't silence. She had heard countless speeches about limits and impossibilities, but never this idea that maybe she wasn't broken beyond repair. Maybe she was just waiting for the right pair of hands to believe in her. The following week, to Olivia's surprise, Daniel showed up at the Carter estate. The driver looked uncomfortable letting him in, but Olivia insisted. She was sitting in the garden, her wheelchair positioned by the roses, when Daniel walked up with the same battered toolbox. "I'm not here for your car," he said with a crooked smile. "I'm here for you." At first, she didn't understand, but then he pulled a small wrench from his box and handed it to her like a gift. "We'll start small," he explained. "If you can turn this back and forth for a few minutes, it'll build your grip and strength." Olivia stared at the tool in her hand. It was heavy, awkward, nothing like the polished therapy equipment she had used in clinics, but she tried. Her fingers trembled at first, her wrists weak from years of inactivity. Still, she managed a slow twist. Daniel nodded approvingly. "Good. That's more work than you think. We'll keep going." Unlike therapists who tracked her progress with cold charts, Daniel's approval felt different, human, unfiltered. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a patient on display. She felt like someone learning again, someone who might have a chance. Richard wasn't convinced. He confronted Daniel after the first session. "You're not a doctor," he said sternly, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to control. "We've had the best in the world work with her. What makes you think you can help?" Daniel didn't flinch. He met Richard's gaze and said quietly, "I don't think she's broken. That's the difference." The billionaire was left speechless. He had never heard anyone speak about his daughter like that. He saw her as precious, fragile, untouchable. But this mechanic, this nobody saw her as capable, fixable, worth rebuilding. Against his instincts, Richard let him continue. Days turned into weeks. Daniel returned almost every afternoon, always with some new contraption from his garage. He turned car parts into exercise tools. An old drive shaft weighted with bolts became a barbell. Springs from suspensions were tied into resistance bands. Olivia laughed the first time she saw him bring in a hubcap and declare it a balance disc. It looked ridiculous, but when she sat on the edge of her chair and tried to steady herself with it, she felt muscles she hadn't used in years begin to wake up. Daniel didn't just repair engines, he was repairing her piece by piece. Their sessions became more than physical therapy. They became conversations. Daniel talked about his own life, how his father had been a mechanic before him, how the garage was the only inheritance he ever received, how he worked long, hours just to keep the lights on. Yet he never spoke bitterly. He had a quiet pride in his work, in the way his hands could give life to things others abandoned. Olivia found herself opening up in ways she never had before. She spoke about the loneliness of wealth, the friends who disappeared, the way doctors' voices haunted her dreams. Sometimes they worked in silence, Daniel adjusting bolts on his makeshift tools, while Olivia pushed herself through exercises. Other times, they shared laughter when something went wrong, like the day a homemade weight snapped and spilled bolts across the floor. Olivia laughed so hard she nearly cried. It was the kind of laughter she hadn't felt in years, the kind that came from feeling alive again. Daniel watched her carefully during those moments, and though he rarely said much, the look in his eyes told her everything. He believed in her, and that belief became fuel stronger than any medicine. The changes were slow, almost invisible at first. Olivia's arms grew steadier. Her legs, once lifeless, began responding in tiny, hesitant movements. She learned to push herself up from the chair for a few seconds, then longer. Each milestone, no matter how small, was celebrated like a victory. Daniel never let her dismiss her progress. "Every bolt matters in an engine," he told her once. "Take one out, and it all falls apart." Every little movement you make, it's a bolt holding you together. Don't forget that. His metaphors, drawn from grease and gears, somehow made more sense to her than years of medical jargon. At night, when Olivia lay in bed, she replayed the day's exercises in her mind. She could still feel the ache in her muscles, the dull soreness that strangely comforted her. It was proof she had fought. Proof she was no longer passive. She found herself smiling before falling asleep, something she hadn't done since before the accident. Her dreams began to change too. Instead of reliving the crash, she dreamed of standing, of walking across a garage floor with Daniel cheering her on. For the first time in 7 years, her subconscious dared to believe in a different ending. The air that evening carried the chill of approaching autumn, crisp and sharp, with the scent of fallen leaves. The garden of the Carter estate glowed beneath golden lights strung along the path. Olivia sat in her wheelchair, her fingers clenched tightly in her lap. Months of effort, months of sweat and trembling had all led to this moment. Daniel crouched before her, his hands steady on her knees. "Just once," he said softly, his voice firm but kind. "Try standing. I'll hold you. I won't let you fall." His words were simple, yet they carried a weight greater than any doctor's prescription. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Olivia's heart thundered like a drum inside her ribs. She had dreamed of this moment so many times that it felt unreal. Fear swirled in her stomach. Fear of failing. Again. Fear of collapsing. Fear of proving everyone right that she was broken forever. But Daniel's eyes anchored her, steady and unshakable. She placed her trembling hands on his arms, the warmth of his skin grounding her. He gave a small nod, and slowly, with a strength she didn't know she had, Olivia pressed down and began to lift herself from the chair. The world seemed to hold its breath. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her knees wobbled, her legs shook violently, and for a split second she was certain she would crash back into the chair. But Daniel's arms stayed firm, steadying her like unyielding steel. And then it happened. After 7 years, confined to metal and wheels, Olivia Carter was standing, wobbly, unsteady, tears already spilling down her cheeks, but standing. Her breath came in gasps, disbelief flooding her veins. She whispered through sobs, I'm up." Her voice cracked under the weight of the impossible becoming real. Daniel's own throat tightened as he held her upright. His voice came out as a whisper, rough with emotion. "You're stronger than you think." He didn't cheer loudly, didn't celebrate with grand words. He simply spoke the truth he had always seen in her, the truth she had fought so hard to deny. She clung to him like a lifeline, and step by shaky step she moved forward. First one foot dragging and trembling, then another. The gravel beneath her shoes crunched faintly, a sound so ordinary, yet for Olivia it was a symphony, a miracle in every note. The mansion's back doors burst open. Her parents had heard voices outside and came rushing to the garden. Richard Carter, the man who had built skyscrapers and owned half of Los Angeles, stopped in his tracks. His mouth fell open. There, before his eyes, was his daughter, not in her chair, not broken and frail, but standing and moving, one halting step at a time, supported by a poor mechanic. Richard's knees buckled as he staggered forward, his phone slipping unnoticed from his hand. He dropped to the ground, tears flooding his face. "My God! Olivia!" he choked. "You're walking!" Her mother's sobs echoed across the garden as she pressed a trembling hand to her lips. For years, the Carters had spent million specialists in New York, surgeons. In Switzerland, the best equipment money could buy. Each time, they had been told the same cruel truth. She'll never walk again. They had built walls of wealth around their grief. But those walls collapsed in that moment. None of their money, none of their power had given them what this poor mechanic had. Richard crawled closer, his hands shaking as he reached out but dared not touch, as if afraid she would vanish. Olivia's legs wavered with every step, but Daniel's arms steadied her. "Look at them," he whispered to her, his lips close to her ear. "They're seeing the daughter they thought they lost." His words ignited a fire inside her, and though her body screamed with exhaustion, she pushed forward. Each step was agony, each second stretched into eternity, but she refused to stop. She wanted her parents to see her not as fragile, not as broken porcelain, but as alive. The tears rolling down her face weren't just from pain, they were from joy, from freedom, from reclaiming the life stolen years ago. Richard clutched the grass with his fists, his tears falling freely, uncaring who saw. For a man who had bought everything and conquered everything, this was the first time he had been utterly undone. "Thank you," he whispered hoarsely toward Daniel, his voice breaking. "I don't know who you are, but thank you. You've done what the world's best couldn't." Daniel only shook his head. "I didn't heal her," he said gently. "She healed herself. I just reminded her she could." His humility struck the billionaire harder than any speech. For once, Richard Carter felt small, humbled by a man with oil-stained hands. That night, after the emotions had settled into quiet awe, Olivia sat with Daniel in the garage, her wheelchair beside her, but her legs still tingling with the memory of movement. She turned to him, her eyes glowing even through the redness of crying. "Doctors gave me science," she said softly, her voice trembling with gratitude. "But you gave me belief." Daniel's throat tightened, but he only smiled faintly, brushing a smudge of grease from his hand. "Engines don't run on science alone," he replied. "They run on fuel, and belief, that's your fuel." She laughed through her tears, nodding. Word spread quickly through their world. The Carter's daughter, once thought lost to her chair, had stood again. The story reached neighbors, friends, and eventually the media. But Olivia never let the cameras take away the truth. It hadn't been doctors, money, or miracles. It had been a poor mechanic with a stubborn faith in the impossible. She insisted on telling the world exactly that. For Daniel, the spotlight was uncomfortable. He never wanted recognition. He went back to his garage, every morning, wiping oil from his hands, fixing broken cars. Yet everywhere he went, people looked at him differently now. For Olivia, life transformed overnight. Therapy that once felt like punishment now felt like opportunity. Each day, with Daniel at her side, she pushed herself harder. She stumbled, she fell, but she always rose. Again, and her laughter, something her parents hadn't heard in years, began echoing through the Carter mansion once more. That sound was priceless, more valuable than all the money her father had spent. It filled the halls with warmth, reminding them that wealth without love and hope was empty. Sometimes miracles didn't come dressed in white coats or expensive machines. Sometimes they came in grease-stained shirts with calloused hands. In time, Olivia's steps grew steadier. She could cross the garden with a cane, then the hallway, then finally one glorious morning. She walked across her bedroom unassisted. Richard Carter, standing in the doorway, watched in silence before covering his face with his hands. His wife wept openly, whispering prayers of gratitude, but Daniel only stood with quiet pride, clapping once and saying, "See, told you you're stronger than you think." Olivia rushed forward, not stumbling, and embraced him tightly. In that embrace was everything unspoken, her gratitude, her belief, and the undeniable truth that her life had been given back. From then on, Daniel Hayes was not just a poor mechanic. To the world, he became the man who gave a billionaire's daughter her life back. But to Olivia, he was something even greater, her friend, her strength, her reminder that hope could be found in the most unexpected hands. And as autumn leaves fell across Los Angeles, her laughter carried through the mansion's windows like music. It was the sound of a life rebuilt, a future reclaimed, and the proof that sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to stop believing.